Walter pressed the key into her hand at 3 in the morning.
Walter pressed the key into her hand at 3 in the morning. His grip was weak. The stroke had taken something from his right side, and his hand shook with the specific tremor of a body doing its best with what remained. But the pressure was deliberate. The key, small and brass on a worn wooden fob, was placed in Francis Osei's palm with the intention of someone who had been waiting to do this for a long time and was now doing it in the only window still available. He looked at her. He said 2 words. "The Bureau." Then he closed his eyes. Francis sat in the chair beside him for a long time without moving. The sitting room was quiet in the way that rooms go quiet at 3 in the morning. Not silent, but emptied of the specific frequency of daytime. The radiator ticked. Somewhere above them a floorboard settled. The ambulance had left 40 minutes ago. Richard had not answered his phone. There had been 4 attempts. Francis had stood in the hallway and counted each one. She held the key and looked at the bureau in the corner. She had dusted around that bureau for 11 years. Before this story arrives where it must, pause here and drop your city in the comments. Manchester, Accra, Toronto, Birmingham, Lagos, New York. Wherever you are right now, we want to know. This story starts in a suburb of Manchester on a Tuesday night, and it ends somewhere I think you already know is coming. Drop your city. Stay with it. Now, back to Francis. Francis Osei had come to Manchester from Accra in 1993. She was 27 years old. Her English was precise in the specific way of someone who had studied it as a formal language before they spoke it conversationally, and she had arrived with a 2-year plan that had stretched, as 2-year plans do, into 32. She had worked in hospitals as an auxiliary nurse for 4 years. She had moved into home care in 2001 when her daughter Aisha was 6, and the shift work was breaking the childcare arrangements. Home care suited her. Not because it was easy, it was not. It was the specific difficulty of a job that requires you to enter someone's private world daily, manage their dignity and their dependence simultaneously, navigate the intimacy of physical care without pretending the intimacy does not exist, and do all of this without the visible infrastructure of a hospital to confer authority or purpose. You are in someone's home. You are there because they cannot fully manage without you. The relationship has a power dynamic built into it that runs in both directions simultaneously, and the skill of the job is holding both directions at once without collapsing either. Francis was good at the job in the way that certain people are good at things that require an exact alignment between what they are and what the work demands. She was patient without being passive. She was direct without being unkind. She kept meticulous records because she had learned early that in disputes about what had or had not happened in a client's home, the person with written records won, and the person without them did not. She had been assigned to Walter Brandt through the Bridgewater Home Care Agency in September of 2013. Walter was 73 at that time. His wife Eleanor was alive and managing the household with the assistance of a cleaning service and a gardener and her own considerable competence. But her arthritis had advanced to the point where she could no longer manage Walter's personal care alone. The agency had sent Francis for a trial period of 4 weeks. Walter had rejected the first 2 agency workers before Francis. Not formally. He had simply made their working environment so difficult that both had requested reassignment within a fortnight. Francis had stayed. Not because Walter became easier. He did not particularly become easier. He called her the woman. He pointed at things he wanted rather than asking. He made observations about how his wife's previous housekeeper had done things differently in a tone that was not asking for adjustment but performing disappointment. He had a specific quality of dismissal that had been developed across 80 years of being a man who ran things and was accustomed to the world arranging itself around his preferences. Eleanor, who Francis liked immediately and deeply, had apologized for Walter on their second meeting. Francis had said, "I've had worse." Eleanor had looked at her carefully and then laughed. The laugh of a woman who recognized competence and honesty simultaneously and found the combination a relief. They had developed across the 5 years before Eleanor died, the specific friendship of 2 people who see each other clearly in a context that doesn't officially permit friendship but can't prevent it either. Eleanor died of a pulmonary embolism in March of 2019. She was in the hospital when it happened. Francis had held Walter's arm in the corridor outside the ward for 20 minutes while he stood very still and looked at the wall. He had not cried. He had said, "She would have had opinions about the flowers." Francis had said, "Several." And they had stood there with that between them. The small, true thing that neither of them could have said to anyone else in that moment. After Eleanor's death, Walter became more difficult and more dependent in the same proportion, which was the pattern Francis had seen before in men who had been loved and managed by strong women for 50 years and had no structure beneath that love to stand on when it was gone. She did not judge this. She worked around it. She came 5 mornings a week and 2 afternoons. She managed his medication, his meals, his appointments, his correspondence with the GP surgery. She drove him to the barber every 3rd week because he considered this non-negotiable regardless of everything else. Richard Brandt was 54 years old. He worked in corporate finance in London. He had an accent that had been shaped away from Manchester at a boarding school he had attended at 12 and had not returned to in its original form. He visited Walter 4 or 5 times a year. He was not a bad person. Francis was always careful in her own thinking to apply this accuracy to the people she worked around, because the job required clear sight, and clear sight included not constructing villains where something more complicated was actually present. Richard was not a bad person. He was a person who had organized his relationship to his father's situation around logistics and costs and outcomes, and who experienced Francis as a complicating variable in those logistics because she was not easily managed and because Walter refused to move to a care facility as long as she came. Richard had been trying to move Walter to a care facility for 3 years. The facility was a good one. Francis had researched it after the first time Richard raised it. It was clean, well-staffed, appropriate. The people who worked there did the same job she did, but in an institutional setting with institutional supports. There was nothing wrong with it except that it was not what Walter wanted. And what Walter wanted, in the diminishing territory of things he could still control, was to remain in the house he had lived in for 47 years with a routine he understood. Francis had, in the course of her work, become a passive obstacle to Richard's management of the situation. She had not intended this. She had not positioned herself as Walter's advocate or his protector. She had simply continued doing her job thoroughly and without drama. And the consequence of this was that Walter remained at home and Richard remained frustrated. In October, Richard had called Francis on her personal mobile. He had told her that the agency contract was being restructured at the end of the month. The Bridgewater agency was being replaced with a less expensive provider. Francis was welcome to apply with the new agency if she wished. Her current contract would conclude on the 28th. She had said, "Does Walter know?" Richard had said, "I'll tell him when the arrangements are confirmed." She had said, "He'll need time to adjust." Richard had said, "I appreciate your concern. The new agency has excellent ratings." She had said nothing further. She had continued working Walter's regular schedule for the 2 weeks remaining. The house had a specific quality in those 2 weeks that was difficult to name. Not different in any observable way, but carrying the specific weight of an ending that only she knew was coming, like a room before a conversation that has not yet started. Walter was unwell on the Tuesday evening of her final week. Not dramatically. He had a specific grey quality to his face that Francis recognized from previous episodes, a tiredness that sat differently in him than ordinary tiredness. She had noted it. She had taken his blood pressure and his temperature. Both were within range, but at the lower edge of range. She had made him the soup he liked and watched him eat half of it and told him she would call the GP in the morning if he wasn't better. He had waved this off. "You fuss," he said. She had set his medication for the night on the bedside table and said good night. She had driven home to the flat in Wythenshawe. She had made her own dinner and watched the first half of a program she could not afterwards recall the title of and gone to bed. At 2:18 in the morning, the emergency alert app on her phone, connected to the pendant Walter wore and to the house's emergency call system, fired with the sound she had programmed to distinguish it from all other notifications. She lay in the dark for 4 seconds. She called the service line. The dispatcher said an ambulance had been sent. She lay in the dark for another minute. Then she got up. She put on her coat over her pajamas and drove to Walter's house in 11 minutes. She parked behind the ambulance. The paramedics were professional and measured. Walter had experienced a transient ischemic attack, a TIA, a minor stroke that produces temporary neurological symptoms and frequently resolves without lasting damage. He was conscious. He was confused about where he was. He was asking, the junior paramedic told Francis, for the woman. She walked into the sitting room. Walter was in his armchair. They had moved him from the floor where he had fallen, assessed him, determined he did not require hospital admission tonight but needed close observation. One side of his face drooped slightly. He could not close his right hand completely. He was looking at the doorway. He saw her. His expression did something it had not done in 11 years in her presence. It opened. She sat down in the chair beside his. The ambulance crew completed their documentation, gave her the monitoring instructions, left their card. They left at 2:47. Francis heard the front door close and the ambulance pull away. She called Richard. No answer. She called again. No answer. A third time. A text. Everything okay? She replied, your father has had a TIA. He is at home and stable. Please call. She set the phone on the side table. Walter was watching her. She made him tea. She had made him tea so many times across 11 years that the process was structural. Kettle, cup, the specific bag he used, the specific amount of milk, 2.5 minutes exactly, because he had told her once, with considerable precision, that 2 minutes was insufficient and 3 minutes was excessive, and she had noted it and never deviated since. She brought it to him. She placed it where he could reach it with his left hand. He said, you came back. She said, yes. He said, I didn't call you. She said, the app called me. He looked at his tea. He looked at his right hand, which was resting in his lap and not cooperating the way it should. He looked at Francis. He said, you never once let me down. She held that sentence for a moment before responding. He had said a great many things to her across 11 years, and this was not in the category of things he had said. She said, no. He reached with his left hand to the drawer of the side table beside his chair. He opened it. He moved things inside. She could hear the small sounds of objects shifting, and brought out a key on a small wooden fob, worn smooth at the edges from handling. He held it out to her. She took it. He said, the bureau. Then he closed his eyes. His breathing changed into the deeper rhythm of someone who has been holding something for a long time and has finally put it down. She held the key. She looked at the bureau. The bureau was mahogany, Victorian, positioned in the corner of the sitting room beside the window that faced the garden. It had always been locked. She had dusted the surface above it and the sides of it and the brass handles on its locked drawers for 11 years. She had never asked about it because it was locked, and locked things in a client's home were not her business. She walked to it. She put the key in the lock of the upper right drawer. The lock turned. She opened the drawer. Inside, a sealed envelope addressed in Walter's handwriting to Pemberton and Associates, Solicitors, Manchester, and beneath it, a smaller sealed envelope. On the front, F. Osei. In his handwriting. Her name. Her full name, both parts, spelled correctly. She picked up both envelopes. She stood at the bureau with them for a long time. Then she put them back in the drawer. She locked it. She put the key in the pocket of her coat. She went back to the chair beside Walter's armchair and sat down and held her own hands in her lap and waited for the morning. Richard arrived at 7:30. He was in a dark overcoat, the collar still raised from the car park. He was brisk. He was angry in the specific way of a man who has been made to feel negligent and is expressing that discomfort as administrative competence. He looked at the ambulance report that Francis had left on the hallway table. He looked at Francis. He said, "Why are you still here?" She said, "I stayed to monitor him." He said, "You're not authorized for overnight care." Your contract. She said, I called you 4 times. He looked at his phone. He said, I saw the texts this morning. She said nothing. He said, I'm going to speak to the agency about the liability implications of an unauthorized overnight. Richard. Walter's voice came from the sitting room. Thin but clear. Richard went through. Francis stayed in the hallway. She could hear their voices but not their words. Richard's voice had the pace of someone giving a summary of arrangements. Walter's had the particular flatness of someone enduring a summary they did not request. Then Walter said something and Richard's voice stopped. Francis moved to the sitting room doorway. Walter was looking at her, not Richard. He said, Did you find it? She said, Yes. He nodded. He closed his eyes. Richard turned and looked at her. He said, What is he talking about? She said, I'll need to speak with a solicitor. He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back at him with a specific contained expression she had spent 11 years perfecting. The expression that communicated nothing he could use and revealed nothing she was not ready to reveal. She picked up her bag. She said goodbye to Walter, though he did not open his eyes. She left. She drove to the solicitor she had used 3 years earlier when a previous employer's agency had disputed her final pay. A small firm in Chorlton, a woman named Patricia Okafor who had handled the dispute efficiently and who had the specific quality of a solicitor who paid complete attention to the person sitting across from her. Patricia's office had the particular light of a Manchester autumn morning through north-facing windows. Flat, honest, without warmth or drama. Francis sat across the desk and placed both envelopes on the surface between them. She said, One of these is addressed to a solicitor. One is addressed to me. The man who gave them to me had a stroke last night. He pressed them into my hand. She paused. I haven't opened either. Patricia looked at the envelopes. She looked at Francis. How long have you worked for him? She asked. 11 years, Francis said. Patricia picked up the envelope addressed to Francis. She handed it across the desk. Open it first, she said. Francis opened the envelope. Inside, 3 pages, handwritten on Walter's personal stationery. The cream-colored paper he used for private correspondence, the kind with his name printed in small capitals at the top. She read it. She read it twice. Then she set it on the desk and looked out the window at the Manchester street. A bus went past. A woman in a red coat walked a dog with a limp. The morning continued in its ordinary way. He wrote it 2 months ago, Francis said. Patricia was reading over the pages Francis had set down. The letter described the second envelope precisely. It described the statutory declaration inside Walter's account, documented over 14 months with dates and amounts, of Richard's systematic liquidation of estate assets and their diversion to a private account Walter had eventually traced. It described Walter's fear of his son and his uncertainty about what to do, and his decision, after considerable time, to document it in a form that could be used if he could not use it himself. The letter said, I am giving this to Frances Osei because she is the only person I know who will do the right thing without calculating what the right thing costs her. This is not a compliment. It is an observation I have made across 11 years. I know what it is worth. The last paragraph said, I should have said her name. In 11 years I did not say her name as if she were a person with a name rather than a function. Her name is Frances. I have known it since the first week. I did not say it and I have thought about why I did not say it and I do not have an answer that is to my credit. I am saying it now because it is all I have left to give her that is mine to give. Francis kept looking at the window. Patricia Okafor read the letter through once more. Then she set it down carefully. She looked at Francis. He knew your name, Francis said. Yes, Patricia said. The whole time. Yes. Francis pressed her lips together. She looked at her hands. Both of them, flat on her knees, still in the specific stillness of someone who has been moving around something difficult for 11 years and has now arrived at its center. She said, What do I do with the other envelope? Patricia said, You take it to Pemberton and Associates. which is the solicitor Walter addressed it to. I'll call them this morning and explain the situation. They'll receive it formally and begin the necessary process. She paused. What's inside it is not your responsibility to manage beyond this point. You found it, you didn't open it, you brought it here. That's the whole of what you were asked to do, Francis said. Is that enough? Patricia looked at her. Francis. He trusted you with it because he knew you would do exactly this. Not more. Not less. Exactly this. She drove to Pemberton and Associates that afternoon. The senior partner received the envelope. He opened it in front of her and two witnesses. He read the statutory declaration. His expression did not change, which was the expression of a solicitor who has learned to receive information without performing reactions. But his pen stopped moving on his notepad and did not restart for a long time. He looked at her across the desk. He said, "How did you come to have this?" She told him. He said, "And you did not open it before bringing it here?" She said, "No." He said, "You understood what was likely inside." She said, "I understood he wanted the right person to have it." He said, "Yes." He said it quietly. He did. The legal process that followed moved at the pace of legal processes. Not fast, not slow, but with the irreversible quality of formally documented truths being carried through systems designed to hold them. Richard Brandt engaged solicitors of his own. The paper trail Walter had assembled, 14 months of specific dates and specific amounts and specific account numbers, did not have the quality of evidence that could be explained away. The estate's previous solicitor, replaced by Richard 3 years earlier with a firm more receptive to his management decisions, was reinstated by the probate court. Richard's access to the estate accounts was suspended pending investigation. Francis was not asked to testify. What she had done was deliver a sealed envelope addressed to its intended recipient. That was her part. She had done her part. Walter was moved to the care facility in Altrincham in November. The good one. The one Francis had researched 3 years ago when Richard first raised it. Francis knew the facility manager through a professional connection. She called him. She asked him to give Walter the room on the south side with the garden view because Walter had tended his own garden for 47 years, and the sight of growing things was one of the remaining pleasures that had not diminished. He got the room on the south side. She visited twice before Walter died. The first visit, he was awake, sitting in the chair by the window. He looked at her when she came in and said her name. Francis. She sat down. She said, "Walter." They sat together for an hour. He was tired and spoke slowly and sometimes lost the thread of what he was saying. She did not fill the silences. She had learned, across 11 years, when the right thing was to speak and when the right thing was to let the silence carry what words would only diminish. He said at one point, "I was not always kind." She said, "No." He said, "I knew." She said, "I know you knew." He looked at the garden through the window. The November garden, stripped back, the bare lines of it. He said, "Eleanor was kind. She made it look easy." Francis said, "It isn't easy." He said, "No, I know that now." He turned from the window and looked at her. "I knew it then too. I just let her carry it." She stayed until 3 in the afternoon. She drove home. The second visit was 5 days later. Walter was sleeping when she arrived. His breathing had changed. Slower, deeper. The specific rhythm that Francis recognized from previous clients at this stage, as the body beginning to make its peace with the closing distance. She sat beside his bed. The care staff had been in that morning and the room was clean and quiet and the garden view was there through the window. Bare November, but the shape of things still present beneath it. She took his hand. His skin was very thin now. The hand that had pressed a key into hers with such deliberate intention 3 weeks before was completely still. She said his name quietly. He did not wake. She sat for 90 minutes. Then she said goodbye. She kissed the back of his hand, which was something she had never done in 11 years and which required no decision at this point. She left. Walter died on a Thursday afternoon, 2 days later, while Francis was across the city in another home, helping another elderly person whose world had contracted to a few rooms and who needed someone to show up consistently and without drama and be present in the specific way that presence is an act of respect. Aisha called her when she got home. Aisha always called when she knew something was coming. Francis made tea. She sat at the kitchen table with the cup warming both hands. The key on its wooden fob was on the table. She had taken it out of her coat when she came in, the way you take something out of a pocket you know you'll be reaching for, except there was nothing left to reach for it for. She looked at it. Aisha had said, "Mum, are you okay?" She had said, "I think so." She had said, "He said my name, Aisha. In the letter." He wrote it down. And Aisha, who had been worrying about her mother for 3 years, who had watched her mother give consistent care and sustained dignity to a man who called her the woman, said the only thing there was to say, which she said very quietly. "He saw you, Mum." Francis drank her tea. Outside the Withenshaw flat, the November evening was doing what November evenings in Manchester do. Low sky, the amber of streetlights beginning to matter. She could hear the street through the window. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary evening that had not changed because someone in Altrincham had stopped breathing. She looked at the key. She thought about the bureau, locked for 11 years. She thought about Eleanor laughing in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning 8 years ago. She thought about the hour she had spent in the care facility's south room with the garden view, and the way Walter had looked at her when he said her name. Not with guilt. With the specific cleared expression of someone who has finally done the thing they should have done long ago and finds that the doing of it, even late, was worth doing. She picked up the key. She held it for a moment. Then she put it down on the table next to her cup and opened her phone and called Aisha back properly, not just to receive her worry but to talk. To talk about the trip to Accra they had been planning, which they had never managed to take, which they were going to take in the spring because Francis had decided this morning, before any of this, that she was going to take it and she was not going to let anything be in the way of it anymore. Aisha said, "Really?" She said, "Really? Book something." She heard Aisha making the specific sound of someone who has been waiting a long time for a particular answer and has just received it. They talked for an hour. After she hung up, she sat at the table for a while longer. Then she washed her cup, turned off the kitchen light, and went to bed. She was up at 6 the next morning. She had a client at 8, a woman named Doris, 81, sharp-minded, funny, who insisted on doing her own crossword before Francis arrived and left Francis the one she couldn't finish. Francis drove there in the early November grey with the radio on. The ordinary sounds of a Manchester morning, the city going about itself the way it always did regardless of what had or had not happened the previous day. She knocked on Doris's door at 8 o'clock. "You're on time," Doris called from inside. "I'm always on time," Francis said. The door opened. Wherever you are watching this, drop your city in the comments right now. Manchester, Accra, London, Birmingham, Nairobi, Chicago. Wherever this story landed, we want to know. Every city. Drop it. And if this story gave you something, the key on the kitchen table, the hour in a room with a man who could no longer speak but whose hand could still tighten, the specific cost of being present for someone who never said your name, share it with someone who carries that cost every day and has never been thanked for it. They will know what this story is about before the first minute is over. Subscribe to Noir Resurgence. Come back next week. Like this video if Walter writing Francis's name in the last paragraph of the last letter he would ever write stayed with you. We will be here. The stories are here. See you next time.